Hello, sports fans. Welcome to Super Sports Central. So, a few days ago, NFL training camp started, and today we're going to be going over the biggest question for every NFL team. So, starting off with the Buffalo Bills, they have one of the most complete rosters in the NFL, and they really don't have many questions. But their top question is probably what will the offense look like without Brian Daboll. So, Daboll has been given a ton of credit for the development of Josh Allen and how good the offense has been in the past few seasons. But now that Daboll's gone, as he took the Giants' head coaching job, the Bills will obviously not have him as their offensive coordinator. So it will be very interesting to see how the offense, one, transitions to a new offensive system, and two, will the offense still be as good with Daboll no longer in charge of the offense in Buffalo. Next, we have the Patriots. So their big question is, does Mac Jones have enough help? So their receiving core is not great, as their top three receivers are Devontae Parker, Kendrick Bourne, and Jacoby Myers. Also, another question for them, which kind of goes along the same lines of that, is who's going to call plays? As with Josh McDaniels, their offensive coordinator, taking the Raiders' head coaching job, they're without an offensive play caller. And right now the options are either Joe Judge or Matt Patricia, neither of which would be pretty good, because Patricia has a defensive background and Joe Judge is a special teams coordinator, but also has some experience as a wide receiver coach. Next, we have the Dolphins. So, can Tua take the next step is their big question. So, he's been in the league now for 2 years, and he hasn't really had the best career so far, but the Dolphins did a lot to improve this offseason. They traded for Tyreek Hill. They improved the offensive line by adding Connor Williams and Teron Armstead. So, Tua could definitely take a jump. He's got the weapons around him. He's going to have the protection he needs. So, can Tua make the next step, or take the next step? Next, we have the Jets. So, their big question is how good could the offense be? They have second-year quarterback Zach Wilson. They have a pretty good receiving core with rookie Garrett Wilson, Elijah Moore, and Corey Davis. They have a good offensive line. They actually moved Mekhi Becton to right tackle and George Fant to left tackle. They brought in Laken Tomlinson. So, the offensive line actually has the potential to be one of the best in the league. So, if the offensive line could give Zach Wilson time, and he has the weapons to do so, I think he could take a large step forward in year 2, as well as the entire offense. Next, we have the Cincinnati Bengals. Their question is, what's up with Jesse Bates? So, Jesse Bates was franchise tagged this offseason, and he did not report to training camp, and the deadline for players who are franchise tagged to negotiate an extension has passed, without the Bengals and Jesse Bates having an extension in place. So, will Jesse Bates report to training camp at all? Will he report before the start of the season? Will he not report at all? So it's going to be interesting to see what Jesse Bates decides to do. As, obviously, playing on the franchise tag, he will be a free agent after the season and doesn't want to risk any injury. Going on to the Steelers, who would the starting quarterback be? So it's a 3-person competition between Mitch Trubisky, Kenny Pickett, and Mason Rudolph. They're going to need to figure out quarterback, but they can play. The quarterback's going to play behind a terrible offensive line, and no matter who the starting quarterback is, I don't think it would be Mason Rudolph, but if it's Mitch Trubisky or Kenny Pickett, Mike Tomlin is such a good coach, he's always going to find a way to have a team around 500. So I think Mitch Trubisky will be the Week 1 starter, but I think Kenny Pickett will be the starter by the end of the season. Moving on to the Ravens, they actually have 3 questions. So 1, do they extend Lamar Jackson? 2, could they stay healthy? And 3, do they have enough receiving weapons outside of Mark Andrews? So extending Lamar Jackson should be a priority, former NFL MVP. But the Ravens don't seem to be in a rush to extend him. Lamar Jackson doesn't seem to be in a rush for an extension. Second, could the Ravens stay healthy? So they were not healthy last season, as tons of players missed a significant amount of time. So if the Ravens could stay on the field, they're going to be a threat in the NFC North. And the third question, Mark Andrews has established himself as a top 5 tight end. But now, their other receiving options, Devin Duvernay and Rashad Bateman. As Bateman's got potential, but Duvernay is really more of like a number 3 or number 4 receiver. Moving on to the Cleveland Browns, this is probably the most obvious one, and it is, will Deshaun Watson be suspended? So the Browns have a roster that could be a Super Bowl contender if Watson isn't suspended and plays. But if he is suspended for some amount of time, it will probably be Jacoby Brissett at quarterback, and obviously we all know he's not a Super Bowl winning caliber quarterback. So, obviously, will Deshaun Watson be suspended? Moving on to the Jaguars, could Trevor Lawrence take a second-year leap? The Jaguars have made some moves this offseason. They improved the offensive line, also brought in some wide receivers and tight ends like Evan Ingram, Christian Kirk, Zay Jones. So none of the biggest names, but they could definitely help Trevor Lawrence. So will Trevor Lawrence take a second-year leap? Moving on to the Titans is their question, what will the offense look like? So it's obviously going to be a heavy dose of Derrick Henry, but he is coming off a broken foot and missing half the season, and he's already 28 years old. So even with him being arguably the best running back in the NFL, he could still run at a very high level, but would the Titans still give him 30 carries a game coming off a serious injury? They also have a decent quarterback in Ryan Tannehill, and not the greatest receivers, as they have rookie Treylon Burks and a wide receiver Robert Woods, but Robert Woods is coming off a torn ACL. So there's a few questions regarding the offense there, specifically, actually the whole offense. Moving on to the Colts, who's their number 2 wide receiver? So the number 1 wide receiver in Indianapolis is definitely Michael Pittman. They haven't re-signed T.Y. Hilton, and I mean, even if they do, is he still a number 2 because he's gotten older and is not in his prime anymore. They drafted Alec Pierce, so I think he could definitely be a reliable number 2. Moving on to the Texans, they have a ton of question marks. Essentially everything is a question mark here for the Texans. But really the run game, they were the league worst last year. They signed Marlon Mack to help with that. But just the Texans organization is just a question mark. Moving on to the Kansas City Chiefs is, could the defensive rookies play a big role? So the Chiefs secondary hasn't been great, and they lost their best player in the secondary in Tyrann Mathieu, arguably their best player on defense. They also lost Tre'Davious Ward. They drafted cornerback Trent McDuffie and edge rusher George Karlaftis. So McDuffie could be a great addition to the secondary, and he can help, especially because even with Tyrann Mathieu and Ward, they haven't been great. And Karlaftis should definitely help with the pass rush, which aside from Chris Jones has not been good, although Frank Clark is also there, he just re-signed. But they could definitely, if Karlaftis could play at a high level, same with McDuffie, their defense could definitely take a step up. Moving on to the Broncos, they really don't have a true question. Their defense has been great, and their offense should be good with Russell Wilson coming in at quarterback. Maybe the offensive line is a question mark, but really, the Broncos should be a contender in the AFC West and in the AFC, so no true question mark for the Broncos. Moving on to the Raiders, their question is the offensive line. So, they weren't great last year. Alex Leatherwood could be good, but was not very good last season as a rookie. Rookie Dylan Farham could jump into a starting role, and if both of those players play at high levels, they could have a good offensive line, but otherwise, the Raiders still use some help with the offensive line position. Moving on to the Chargers, they have one of the most loaded rosters in the NFL. They don't really have a true question mark. If you want to put one, you could say right tackle, because you have Storm Norton, who has not been very good when he has played, and you have Trey Pipkins battling for the right tackle spot. But aside from the right tackle position, really no question marks. Moving on to the NFC teams, we have, starting off the Giants. Their question is Daniel Jones. So, Jones could turn out to be a really, really good quarterback, but he hasn't shown it yet. The Giants also have a few questions at wide receiver. So, when you look at their wide receivers, they're actually good. You have Kenny Golladay, Sterling Shepard, Darius Slayton, Ricky Wandale Robinson, Kadarius Toney. So, obviously, some young players, decent players like Shepard and Slayton, but some of those players have trouble staying healthy. Golladay is always going to miss time. Shepard's coming off a torn Achilles. He probably won't be ready for the start of the season. Kadarius Toney had some injury problems as a rookie, and that also impacts the success Daniel Jones can have. But Daniel Jones and the receivers, biggest question for the Giants. Also offensive line, but not as much as Daniel Jones. Moving on to the Eagles, can Jalen Hurts take the next step as a passer? So the Eagles have brought in A.J. Brown to be their top wide receiver, and they now have a really, really good 1-2 punch at wide receiver with A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith, plus a top 10 tight end in Dallas Goedert. So Jalen Hurts has proved himself as a runner and what he can do with his legs, but could he take the next step as a passer with now an elite wide receiver in A.J. Brown? Moving on to the Cowboys, their question is the offensive line. They lost 2 offensive linemen in Connor Williams and Leo Collins, but they did draft Tyler Smith. But the Cowboys' offensive line as a whole has had trouble staying healthy. But if able to stay healthy, they could end up being pretty good. But the offensive line and the offensive line health is a question for the Cowboys. Moving on to the Commanders, their question is Carson Wentz. So Wentz has not been very good ever since, I believe it was year 2, when he had his MVP type season and then tore his ACL. But he's now has a fresh start with the Commanders. He has a good wide receiver in Terry McLaurin, as well as a wide receiver with potential, who is very dynamic with the ball in his hands, in Jahan Dotson. So if Wentz could find his MVP form again, the Commanders could actually be contenders. But at the quarterback position, Carson Wentz is just a question mark for the Commanders. Moving on to the Bears, how will Justin Fields fare in year 2? So Fields was not very good as a rookie. He now has a new head coach, Matt Eberflus. Hopefully I said his name correctly. But Fields really isn't in a position to succeed as the Bears actually hired Eberflus as a defensive-minded coach, which doesn't really make sense when you want to develop your young quarterback. Also not the greatest receiving core. You have Darnell Mooney as your number 1, but then you have like Byron Pringle as your number 2. Also, the offensive line is terrible, and Justin Fields will be running for his life and throwing from his back. Moving on to the Packers, who's their number 1 wide receiver? So, the departure of Devontae Adams, now the Packers lack a true number 1 wide receiver, as they have Allen Lazard, Randall Cobb, Christian Watson, and Sammy Watkins, who could be the top option, but of that list, there is not a true number 1 option, as Randall Cobb is pretty old. Allen Lazard established himself as more of like a number 2. Christian Watson and Sammy Watkins are actually both on the PUP list to start training camp. And Sammy Watkins is not the greatest, and Christian Watson is an unproven rookie. Moving on to the Vikings, their biggest question is cornerback. So they have 3 corners that could start: Patrick Peterson, Cam Dantzler, and Andrew Booth Jr. They have a few different combos they could do in the secondary or at corner. But what I would do is I would have Peterson and Dantzler starting on the outside with Andrew Booth Jr. in the slot, as he played a little bit of slot in college. Moving on to the Lions. Their secondary is a question mark, as you have former number 3 overall pick Jeff Okudah, but he is coming off a torn Achilles, and that's always a serious injury no matter what position they play. You also have Amani Oruwariye, and at corner, and then you have safeties Sean Elliott and Tracy Walker. But really, you could upgrade all those positions, but the Lions could definitely use help in the secondary. Moving on to the Buccaneers is tight end, and specifically Cameron Brate filled the tight end hole. So Rob Gronkowski retired, and O.J. Howard left in free agency. So now that just leaves Cameron Brate of the 3 that was there last season. The Buccaneers also brought in Kyle Rudolph, so those 2 should definitely help fill that tight end hole, but can they, is the question for the Buccaneers. Moving on to the Panthers, how long before they admit Baker Mayfield is the starter? So they've praised Sam Darnold in the offseason. Earlier in the offseason, they've even said he's their starter, but after trading for Baker Mayfield, it seems to be very clear that Baker Mayfield should be the starting quarterback, but how long before the Panthers coaching staff actually admits that Baker Mayfield should be and will be the starter? Moving on to the Falcons, they have a ton of questions, not just one, but one specific one is quarterback. So they have Marcus Mariota, and they named him the starter, but you have rookie Desmond Ridder also on the roster, as Mariota could be good, but he hasn't been a starter in a few years, and I expect Ridder and Mariota to both play at quarterback, as the Falcons really have nothing to play for this season. Like, obviously everyone has something to play for, but like, it seems like the Falcons are already playing for the number 1 pick rather than a Super Bowl. Moving on to the Saints, their biggest question is Alvin Kamara. So if you remember, he was arrested in Las Vegas at the Pro Bowl, and he could be suspended, so we really don't know what would happen there, and that would be a huge blow to the Saints offense. And the offense could also be getting Michael Thomas back, who's had ankle problems, but he's practiced for the first time in 18 months. And now if you're going to lose Alvin Kamara, that could be a big blow to the offense. Moving on to the last division, and that is the NFC West. Starting off with the Rams. Their question, really they don't have one, but could the offensive line be equally as good, as they had some players leave and retire, such as reliable left tackle Andrew Whitworth. So really, could they fill the hole of Andrew Whitworth, and also will the offensive line be equally as good as last year? Moving on to the Seahawks, who will their starting quarterback be? So Drew Lock or Geno Smith, Geno Smith may actually have the edge because he played in Seahawks offense before. But could he beat out Drew Lock for the starting job is their question. They just extended DK Metcalf, so his future in Seattle is not really a question mark because he's now locked up for the next 3 years. Moving on to the Cardinals, could Hollywood Brown be the go-to wide receiver while DeAndre Hopkins is suspended? So remember, Hopkins got suspended the first 6 games of the season for performance-enhancing drugs. The Cardinals traded for Hollywood Brown during the draft, and he was the Ravens' top receiver, but could he fill the void Hopkins leaves because Hopkins is one of the best receivers in football? Is a question for the Cardinals. And the final team is the 49ers, and is Trey Lance ready to take control of the team? So yesterday the 49ers announced Trey Lance would be the starter, but is he ready to take full control of the offense? Also another question is, what are they going to do with Jimmy Garoppolo? Are they going to trade him? Are they going to cut him? What's the deal with him? So that's all for this video. Thank you for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. I do my best to post as often as possible. If there's a question I missed for a certain team, let me know in the comments below. So make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. I do my best to post as often as possible, and I will see you in the next video.